The feeling arrives long before the understanding. It emerges quietly, not in the middle of crowds but often after them. It settles in during long drives, silent evenings, empty rooms, and moments when life appears normal from the outside, yet strangely distant from within. Throughout the biblical record, one pattern appears with remarkable consistency. Before individuals were entrusted with significant assignments, before their names became part of sacred history, before their journeys influenced generations, they experienced seasons of profound isolation. Their stories unfolded across deserts, mountains, caves, wilderness regions, foreign lands, and forgotten territories. The loneliness was not accidental. It became part of the process. The historical timeline of Scripture reveals that separation often preceded purpose. The geographical movement of many chosen individuals follows a similar sequence. First came removal, then came preparation, then came assignment. The pattern begins early. Far from the centers of power and influence, Abraham lived in Ur, one of the major cities of the ancient Near East. Surrounded by culture, commerce, and established traditions, he occupied a place connected to the wider world. Yet the journey that would define his life began when he was called to leave. The route stretched northwest along the Fertile Crescent toward Haran and eventually south into Canaan. Every mile increased the distance between him and everything familiar. The journey was not merely physical, it was emotional. The land ahead remained largely unknown. The promises were larger than the visible reality around him. In practical terms, Abraham became a traveler moving through territories where certainty disappeared and dependence increased. The loneliness of the chosen often begins there. Familiar voices grow quieter while future answers remain distant. The map changes faster than understanding. Centuries later, another figure entered a similar process. Joseph's story unfolded across vast distances. Beginning in Canaan, he was separated from his family and transported southwest toward Egypt. The journey carried him away from everyone who knew him. The terrain changed, the language changed, the culture changed. The future vanished behind uncertainty. From a historical perspective, Egypt represented one of the most powerful civilizations in the world. Yet Joseph experienced profound isolation within its borders. Sold into slavery, imprisoned, forgotten by those he helped, he endured years during which his destiny appeared hidden. Looking at the chronology, it becomes evident that some of the most significant developments in Joseph's character occurred during periods when no audience existed. No public recognition accompanied those years. No visible reward justified the suffering. The chosen often discover that loneliness strips away dependence on applause. When no one is watching, motives become visible. When no one understands, conviction is tested. The timeline continues with Moses. His life divides into distinct geographical chapters. The first unfolds along the Nile within Egypt. The second unfolds across Midian, east of the Gulf of Aqaba. The third unfolds across the wilderness regions between Egypt and the Promised Land. The middle chapter remains especially significant. After fleeing Egypt, Moses disappeared into isolation for decades. The man raised among royalty became a shepherd in remote territory. The deserts of Midian were not places of public influence. They were landscapes of silence. Mountains dominated the horizon. Sparse vegetation covered the terrain. Long stretches of solitude became part of daily existence. From a historical standpoint, those decades appear almost hidden. Yet they formed one of the most important preparation periods in biblical history. The future leader of Israel first learned how to walk through wilderness before leading others through it. The chosen often feel alone because preparation frequently occurs away from visibility. The world notices outcomes. God often works in obscurity. The same pattern appears in the life of David. Before Jerusalem, before the throne, before military victories and national leadership, there were hillsides. The terrain surrounding Bethlehem became David's classroom. Sheep moved across rocky fields, while seasons passed unnoticed by most people. The youngest son in his family spent long hours separated from others. During that period, no crown rested upon his head, no kingdom belonged to him, no public role identified his future, yet the isolation served a purpose. In those quiet places, skills developed. Character matured, perspective expanded. Later, after being anointed, David experienced another form of loneliness. Instead of immediately ascending to power, he became a fugitive. His movement across the landscape of ancient Israel reveals years spent in caves, wilderness strongholds, forests, and remote regions. Locations such as Adullam, En-Gedi, and the wilderness of Ziph became temporary refuges. The future king spent extended periods separated from normal life. The promise existed, but fulfillment remained distant. This is another recurring feature in the journeys of the chosen. The promise often arrives before the fulfillment. Between them lies a territory marked by waiting. That territory can feel remarkably lonely. The chronology of Scripture repeatedly demonstrates that divine timing rarely aligns with human expectations. As the biblical narrative progresses, the wilderness theme grows even more visible. Israel itself became a collective example. After leaving Egypt, the nation entered a journey that lasted decades. The route from slavery to inheritance did not follow the shortest possible path. Instead, movement unfolded through desert regions stretching across the Sinai Peninsula. Camps shifted from location to location. Generations rose and fell. The environment itself reinforced dependence. Resources remained limited. Conditions remained difficult. The people experienced isolation not only from other nations, but also from the familiar structures they had known before. The wilderness became a place where identity was reshaped. The chosen often experience similar seasons. Old identities fade before new ones emerge. Previous sources of security disappear before stronger foundations develop. The process can feel lonely because transitions rarely provide immediate clarity. The pattern reaches another powerful expression in the ministries of the prophets. Elijah spent time near the brook Cherith, east of the Jordan River. The location was remote. The circumstances were unusual. National crisis unfolded elsewhere while Elijah remained hidden. Later, after dramatic confrontations and remarkable victories, he found himself traveling through wilderness regions once again. The historical account demonstrates something often overlooked. Spiritual significance does not eliminate loneliness. In fact, many individuals assigned important roles experienced deep seasons of isolation. Jeremiah stood largely alone while delivering difficult messages. Ezekiel carried out his ministry among exiles far from Jerusalem. Daniel served within a foreign empire separated from the homeland of his ancestors. Their influence eventually became immense, but their journeys often included profound solitude. By the time the narrative reaches the 1st century, the pattern remains unchanged. John the Baptist emerged from the wilderness regions near the Jordan River. His ministry began away from major population centers. Crowds eventually gathered, but the preparation occurred in isolation. Then comes the story of Jesus. From a historical and geographical perspective, his ministry involved constant movement across Galilee, Samaria, Judea, and surrounding regions. Yet even within that active ministry, periods of withdrawal repeatedly appear. Mountains, wilderness locations, and solitary places became significant settings. Before public ministry began, 40 days unfolded in the wilderness. Before major decisions, periods of solitude occurred. Before the events leading to the crucifixion, isolation intensified. The Garden of Gethsemane represents one of the most profound moments in the biblical timeline. Surrounded by others, yet carrying a burden none could fully share, the experience illustrates a reality found throughout Scripture. Certain assignments contain dimensions that cannot be entirely transferred to another person. The chosen often feel alone because portions of their journey are uniquely theirs to walk. This does not mean abandonment. It means preparation for responsibilities that require personal conviction rather than borrowed certainty. Across centuries of biblical history, the geographical pattern remains remarkably consistent. Mountains become places of encounter. Wilderness regions become places of transformation. Foreign lands become places of preparation. Caves become places of preservation. Isolated roads become pathways toward destiny. The movement itself tells a story. Again and again, individuals are separated before they are positioned. They are hidden before they are revealed. They are tested before they are trusted. From a human perspective, loneliness often appears as evidence that something has gone wrong. Yet the biblical record repeatedly presents another possibility. Sometimes isolation is not a sign of rejection. Sometimes it becomes part of refinement. Sometimes the distance from familiar voices creates space for deeper clarity. Sometimes the removal of distractions allows greater focus. Sometimes the absence of immediate answers develops stronger endurance. Looking across the entire biblical timeline, from Abraham leaving Ur to the early church spreading throughout the Roman world, one truth emerges repeatedly. The path of the chosen frequently passes through seasons where companionship feels limited, understanding feels scarce, and certainty feels distant. Yet those seasons consistently occupy strategic locations within the larger story. They are not the destination, they are transitions. They are not evidence that the journey has failed. They are often evidence that the journey is advancing. History reveals that many of the most influential figures in Scripture encountered loneliness not at the end of their purpose, but on the way toward it. Their maps included deserts, mountains, foreign territories, wilderness roads, and hidden places. Their timelines included waiting, uncertainty, separation, and silence. Yet those same maps eventually led to fulfillment, and those same timelines ultimately revealed meaning that could not be seen while the journey was still unfolding. The progression becomes even clearer when the biblical timeline is viewed as a continuous historical journey rather than a collection of isolated events. Across centuries, generations encountered the same sequence. Separation came first. Understanding arrived later. The loneliness experienced by the chosen was rarely explained while it was occurring. Meaning emerged only after enough time had passed to reveal the larger pattern. One of the most revealing examples appears during the Babylonian exile. In the 6th century before Christ, Jerusalem fell to the armies of Babylon. The city that had served as the spiritual and political center of Judah was devastated. Thousands were taken eastward, across hundreds of miles of harsh terrain toward Mesopotamia. The geographical movement was dramatic. Families were uprooted. Familiar landscapes disappeared behind them. The temple, which had represented the heart of national identity, was left behind. Among the exiles was Daniel. His story illustrates another dimension of chosen loneliness. Unlike wilderness isolation, Daniel experienced isolation within crowded cities. Babylon was one of the largest urban centers of the ancient world. Massive walls surrounded it. Palaces, temples, markets, and administrative buildings filled its interior. Yet physical proximity to people did not eliminate loneliness. Daniel lived among thousands while remaining distinct from them. His values differed. His commitments differed. His vision of history differed. He occupied positions of influence while carrying convictions that set him apart from the culture around him. The loneliness of the chosen is not always geographical. Sometimes it emerges because purpose creates separation in perspective. The person sees reality through a lens shaped by assignment, while those around them continue operating according to different priorities. Throughout the biblical narrative, this pattern repeats constantly. Noah experienced it before the flood. Surrounded by an entire generation moving in one direction, he moved in another. The geographical setting remained the same, but the internal distance grew larger every year. Lot experienced it in Sodom. Ruth experienced it when she left Moab. Esther experienced it within the Persian court. Nehemiah experienced it while carrying the burden of Jerusalem's restoration. In each case, isolation emerged because destiny often places individuals between two worlds. The old chapter is ending. The new chapter has not fully arrived. The chosen frequently occupy that uncomfortable middle territory. Looking at the chronology of Israel's kings reveals another significant pattern. The most important turning points often occurred away from public attention. Saul's rise began in obscurity. David's preparation unfolded in obscurity. Even after receiving confirmation of future leadership, years passed before visible fulfillment appeared. Modern expectations often assume that purpose should immediately produce results. The biblical timeline suggests otherwise. Delay appears repeatedly. Waiting appears repeatedly. Hidden seasons appear repeatedly. The historical record almost seems to insist that significant assignments require development that occurs outside public visibility. This helps explain why loneliness appears so frequently in the lives of the chosen. Public influence is often preceded by private formation. Before people can carry responsibility, they must learn stability. Before they can guide others, they must learn endurance. Before they can navigate complex challenges, they must develop strength that does not depend upon constant encouragement. The ministry journeys recorded in the New Testament further reinforce this principle. The apostles traveled enormous distances throughout the Roman world. Maps of their movements reveal a network of routes connecting Jerusalem, Antioch, Ephesus, Corinth, Philippi, Thessalonica, Rome, and many other locations. Travel in the ancient world was difficult and often dangerous. Roads crossed mountains, deserts, coastlines, and foreign territories. Communication remained slow. Separation from familiar communities frequently lasted months or years. The spread of the early church depended upon individuals willing to enter unknown environments where support systems were limited. The loneliness associated with those journeys was real. Yet those same journeys transformed history. The chosen often discover that comfort and calling do not always occupy the same territory. Sometimes the path toward greater impact leads away from familiar surroundings. Sometimes growth requires movement beyond established boundaries. The Apostle Paul provides one of the clearest examples. After his dramatic encounter on the road to Damascus, the transition was not immediate. Time passed, preparation occurred, relationships developed gradually, acceptance came slowly. Looking at the sequence historically, it becomes apparent that Paul spent years moving through regions such as Arabia, Syria, Cilicia, and eventually the wider Mediterranean world. During those years, he often occupied a unique position. His past separated him from one group. His future connected him to another. Yet neither fully understood the entire journey. This is another recurring feature of chosen loneliness. Transformation can create temporary isolation because the person no longer fully belongs to the previous chapter while not yet fully arriving in the next one. Throughout Scripture, mountains repeatedly serve as locations where isolation and revelation intersect. Mount Sinai stands as one of the most significant examples. Rising from the rugged terrain of the Sinai Peninsula, it became a place where Moses encountered God while separated from the crowds below. The geographical image is powerful. An entire nation waited beneath the mountain while one individual ascended higher. The distance represented more than elevation, it represented preparation. Responsibility often requires solitude because clarity develops in environments free from constant noise. Later, Mount Carmel became the setting for Elijah's confrontation with the prophets of Baal. Mount Hermon marked the northern reaches of Israel's territory. The Mount of Olives became deeply connected to events surrounding the final days of Jesus' earthly ministry. Again and again, elevated places became locations where significant transitions occurred. The biblical landscape itself reinforces the idea that movement away from familiar environments often precedes greater understanding. The deserts tell a similar story. The wilderness of Paran, the wilderness of Zin, the Judean wilderness, and numerous other regions occupy important places in biblical geography. These landscapes were not comfortable. Temperatures fluctuated dramatically. Resources were limited. Travel required endurance. Yet these very regions repeatedly became places of preparation. In human terms, wilderness seasons feel empty. In biblical history, wilderness seasons often proved productive. They removed distractions. They exposed weaknesses. They strengthened dependence. They clarified priorities. The chosen frequently feel alone because the process of preparation often requires environments where unnecessary influences lose their power. Looking across the centuries, another pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Isolation often intensified immediately before major transitions. Joseph experienced years of imprisonment before elevation. Moses spent decades in Midian before returning to Egypt. David endured years as a fugitive before becoming king. Daniel served faithfully for years before receiving some of his most significant revelations. John the Baptist emerged from obscurity shortly before beginning his ministry. Jesus entered the wilderness before public ministry commenced. The sequence appears repeatedly. Loneliness is followed by movement. Waiting is followed by advancement. Preparation is followed by assignment. The timeline does not suggest that loneliness itself is the goal. Rather, it often functions as a corridor leading towards something larger. One reason the chosen feel alone is because their journeys frequently unfold ahead of visible confirmation. The destination exists, but the evidence remains limited. Abraham walked toward a land he had never seen. Joseph carried dreams that contradicted his circumstances. Moses carried a calling that seemed impossible within his environment. David carried a promise while hiding in caves. The gap between promise and reality created tension. That tension often produced loneliness. Human beings naturally seek reassurance from visible results, yet much of biblical history unfolds during periods when visible results remain absent. Faithful movement continues anyway. Another striking observation emerges when examining the locations associated with divine encounters. Many occurred in places removed from centers of power. Moses encountered the burning bush far from Egypt's palaces. Elijah heard the still small voice far from royal courts. John received the revelation while exiled on the island of Patmos. Geographically, these locations were peripheral. Historically, they appeared insignificant, yet they became settings for some of the most important moments in Scripture. The chosen often feel alone because history repeatedly demonstrates that significance is not always found where crowds gather. Some of the most consequential developments occur in places the world overlooks. By the time the biblical narrative reaches its conclusion, the pattern remains intact. The movement of the early church spread outward from Jerusalem across continents. Communities emerged throughout Asia Minor, Greece, North Africa, and eventually Europe. The expansion required individuals willing to leave familiar surroundings. It required people willing to endure uncertainty. It required people willing to walk through seasons where outcomes remained unclear. The loneliness associated with those journeys became part of the larger mission. Looking back from the perspective of history, the meaning becomes visible. Looking forward from within the experience, the meaning often remained hidden. This tension lies at the heart of why the chosen feel alone. They frequently occupy chapters that cannot yet be fully understood. They move through landscapes whose significance will only become clear later. They travel roads that appear isolated in the moment, but eventually connect to a larger destination. Scripture consistently portrays these seasons not as evidence of abandonment, but as recurring features of transformative journeys. The geography changes, the centuries change, the names change. Yet the pattern remains remarkably consistent. Across deserts and mountains, across kingdoms and empires, across generations and cultures, the chosen repeatedly discover that loneliness often accompanies preparation, and preparation often precedes purpose. The maps of biblical history reveal it. The timelines of biblical history confirm it. The journeys of biblical history illustrate it with remarkable clarity. The final perspective emerges when all these journeys are viewed together as one continuous movement across biblical history. From the earliest patriarchs to the expansion of the early church, the same geographical and chronological rhythm appears again and again. Individuals are called. Separation follows. Preparation unfolds. Purpose eventually emerges. The loneliness experienced along the way is rarely presented as the destination. Instead, it functions as a passage through which transformation occurs. When the entire biblical timeline is examined from beginning to end, the pattern becomes impossible to dismiss. The chosen often walk roads that few others understand, because those roads are leading somewhere most people have never gone. Consider the enormous span of history covered by Scripture. Abraham's journey began around the second millennium before Christ. The apostolic missions extended into the 1st century after Christ. Across nearly 2,000 years of recorded movement, countless individuals encountered seasons when their circumstances appeared disconnected from their future significance. The gap between present reality and future fulfillment frequently produced isolation. Yet the historical outcome repeatedly revealed that those hidden seasons occupied essential positions within a larger sequence. The story of Jacob illustrates this clearly. Forced to leave his homeland, he traveled north toward Haran. The route carried him away from familiar surroundings and into uncertainty. Along that journey came nights spent alone beneath open skies, far from the protection of family structures he had always known. Yet the very locations associated with loneliness became locations associated with transformation. Bethel emerged as one of the most significant places in Jacob's journey. The location was not a palace, a city center, or a gathering place of influence. It was a stopping point along a difficult road. Yet history remembers it because moments of clarity often arrive during transitions rather than destinations. The chosen frequently feel alone because they are moving through transitional territory. They have left one chapter behind while another chapter remains incomplete. The emotional weight of that position appears throughout Scripture. Centuries later, another traveler moved through unfamiliar territory under very different circumstances. The account of Philip and the Ethiopian official unfolds along a desert road connecting Jerusalem and Gaza. The geographical setting is significant. Important encounters frequently occurred in places that appeared empty. Roads through wilderness regions became locations where history quietly changed direction. The biblical narrative repeatedly emphasizes movement rather than permanence. People travel, nations migrate, prophets journey, exiles return, messengers cross borders. Throughout all these movements, periods of solitude appear naturally. The chosen often find themselves between locations because purpose frequently involves transition. The Book of Acts reinforces this principle repeatedly. The expansion of the early church unfolded through travel routes stretching across the Mediterranean world. Ancient ports connected distant regions. Roman roads linked major cities. Merchant routes crossed mountains and coastlines. The movement of the gospel depended upon individuals willing to leave familiar environments. Every journey involved uncertainty. Every destination involved risk. Every transition required faithfulness before outcomes became visible. Looking at maps of these journeys reveals something important. Progress rarely occurred in straight lines. Routes changed. Delays occurred. Obstacles appeared. Unexpected developments redirected plans. The same dynamic appears throughout the lives of many chosen individuals. Their stories do not unfold according to predictable patterns. Instead, movement often occurs through detours, interruptions, and seasons that appear confusing while they are being experienced. Joseph never planned to reach Egypt through betrayal. Moses never planned to spend decades in Midian. David never planned to live among caves and wilderness strongholds. Daniel never planned to serve in Babylon, yet those very locations became essential parts of their preparation. Loneliness often emerges because the chosen cannot immediately see how present circumstances connect to future outcomes. The connection only becomes visible later. Another revealing pattern emerges when examining biblical leadership transitions. Major shifts frequently occurred during periods of apparent isolation. Joshua spent years serving before assuming leadership. Elisha followed Elijah before receiving greater responsibility. Timothy developed under Paul's guidance before carrying assignments of his own. These transitions unfolded gradually. They required patience. They required growth that could not be rushed. The chosen often feel alone because preparation operates according to a timetable different from human preference. History demonstrates that lasting influence is usually built slowly. Looking across the biblical landscape, one also notices how frequently rivers mark turning points. The Jordan River serves as a powerful example. Israel crossed it before entering the Promised Land. Elijah crossed it before being taken up. Elisha crossed it during his transition into leadership. Jesus was baptized within its waters before his public ministry began. Rivers represent movement from one stage into another. The chosen frequently experience loneliness while standing near such transitions. The old season is ending. The new season is approaching. Yet the crossing has not fully occurred. That intermediate space can feel uncertain because it belongs neither entirely to the past nor entirely to the future. Mountains, deserts, rivers, foreign lands, and wilderness roads all contribute to the same larger narrative. Scripture repeatedly uses geography to illustrate transformation. Places matter because journeys matter. Locations matter because movement matters. The chosen are rarely portrayed as remaining stationary. Instead, they are often shown advancing through landscapes that shape them along the way. Every environment contributes something. Deserts develop endurance. Mountains provide perspective. Wilderness regions cultivate dependence. Foreign territories expand understanding. Hidden places foster preparation. The loneliness associated with these locations is often temporary, but the lessons gained there become permanent. The final chapters of biblical history further reinforce this truth. John, the author of Revelation, received his visions while on Patmos, a small island in the Aegean Sea. Exile created separation. Isolation created stillness. Yet from that isolated location emerged one of the most influential prophetic texts in history. Once again, the pattern remained intact. What appeared insignificant became significant. What appeared lonely became purposeful. What appeared hidden eventually became visible. Throughout Scripture, the chosen repeatedly discover that isolation and abandonment are not the same thing. The historical record carefully distinguishes between them. Isolation often describes the environment. Abandonment would describe the absence of purpose. Yet purpose continues moving beneath the surface even when circumstances suggest otherwise. The biblical narrative consistently presents a God who remains active during hidden seasons. Events continue unfolding. Preparation continues developing. Movement continues advancing. The larger story continues progressing even when individual chapters feel quiet. This perspective transforms the way biblical loneliness is understood. Instead of functioning as evidence that something has failed, it often functions as evidence that a transition is underway. The chosen feel alone because growth frequently occurs beyond public visibility. They feel alone because preparation often requires separation from distractions. They feel alone because their journeys sometimes move ahead of visible confirmation. They feel alone because purpose frequently develops before recognition arrives. The maps of Scripture reveal this. The chronology of Scripture confirms it. The lives recorded throughout Scripture illustrate it repeatedly. From Ur to Canaan, from Egypt to Sinai, from Bethlehem to Jerusalem, from Babylon to Jerusalem again, from Jerusalem to Rome and beyond. The biblical story unfolds through movement. Individuals leave familiar places. They travel through uncertainty. They encounter isolation. They continue forward. Eventually, the significance of the journey becomes visible. History remembers the outcomes, but Scripture preserves the process. That process repeatedly includes seasons of loneliness. Yet those seasons never stand alone. They exist within larger narratives of preparation, transformation, and fulfillment. When viewed across the full scope of biblical history, the pattern becomes remarkably clear. The chosen often feel alone, not because they have been forgotten, but because they are traveling through chapters that have not yet revealed their final meaning. The deserts eventually lead somewhere. The wilderness roads eventually connect to destinations. The mountains eventually provide perspective. The hidden places eventually give way to visible purpose. The timelines of Scripture consistently move in that direction. The geography of Scripture consistently points toward that reality. And the journeys of the chosen consistently demonstrate that some of the most important developments in history occurred long before anyone else could see what was being prepared.